In this example, we're going to look at creating a couple custom annotations, then we're going to apply those annotations, and then we're going to look at processing those annotations. So let's start with first an annotation here. We will call this our custom type annotation. Now specifically, this is going to be processed at runtime, and this is able to be added to a type, which means we can put this at the class level, and that's where we're going to be able to use this custom type annotation. Notice we use the @ interface to denote this is an annotation. Now we're going to add a few things, and we can add different pieces of data to our annotation, and we've done two things here. First, we've actually created a local enum. We called it priority, and we created 3 enums for this: low, medium, and high priority. And we've created a property on this annotation which is called priority. It is of type priority, and the default value, if you do not provide a priority, is medium. Now, we can also put a lot of different types inside of our annotation. Now we've created a few here. We've created a string array, which is known as tags, and the default is blank. There are no tags associated by default. We're going to add some though. We have a created by, which is a string, and a last modified, which is also a string, and they both have default values. Now that's a type annotation we're creating, and we're going to create a second one just to show we can create multiple types. We're going to create another one called a custom method annotation, and this is a little different. So this is going to be only applicable at the point of a method. I cannot apply this at a type level. I will get an exception, and I'm going to show you how that will occur actually. So this is called custom method annotation, and this has one method to it, which is enabled, which returns a Boolean. Now the default is true, which means by default this is enabled. Now let's look at applying the annotation next. We've got 2 annotations, and now we're going to apply one. So first, let's apply this first one at the top. Now we're going to have a class called annotation example. We're going to create a custom type annotation, and the priority is, of course, something I want to change. I don't want it to be the default, so I need to say I want a custom type annotation, which this is where my enum lives. Dot priority is my enum. Dot high. So this is going to be a high priority annotation. And it's created by M. Knudsen, and now I also have a set of tags. By default, it was blank. I've created a Java, comma, annotation tag. So 2 tags for this. Now, just as an example, let's actually look, let's try something here. We know we have another annotation called custom method annotation. Well, let's try to add it here, and let's see what happens. Whoa, look at there. We've got an exception. Now, if we roll over this, we actually show that the annotation, custom method annotation, is disallowed for this location. Again, it's only allowed at the method level. The same thing is true for our custom type annotation. Same thing here. If I did this again, if I did this, I am going to get a very similar exception. It is not allowed for this location. So this allows us to scrutinize where the annotations will be and can be placed. So next, we do have a method ones. Let's look at a couple ones here. So just for an example, we're going to create one method that says this should always be processed, and it's going to return a string for this. Now remember, this annotation has a method called enabled, which is true by default. Now we're going to do another one here. We're actually going to create another method. This is going to say we'll throw an exception just to show what happens when we try to process an annotation, and this is going to return a runtime exception. And the last one here, last method, we're actually going to say that this should not be processed because the enabled is false. Thus, if we do try to process this, we will also throw a runtime exception. So that's us applying the annotations. Now, it's the processing of the annotations that we actually get some functionality with this. So let's look at processing these annotations. So next, now remember, first of all, I'm going to show that we're actually going to be using a couple different classes. We're going to use the java.lang.annotation.annotation class, and we're going to be using the java.lang.reflect.method class as well. So let's look at this individually. We're going to go with a public static void main, and we're going to do a couple things here first. First, let's just set up some defaults here. So we're going to put a couple integers in place. We're going to look at how many annotations we successfully processed, how many annotations failed processing, the total number of annotations we processed, and how many annotations were disabled. Now, the first thing we're going to do, we're going to try to get from our annotation example. Remember, this is where we applied our annotation. We want to get out this class. We want the class type for this, not a create an instance. We want a class type, and it is of type annotation example. We'll call this our object in question that has annotations applied to it. So now, let's do just this right here. Now, I'm going to do it in a couple steps for clarity. First of all, let's actually make sure that we can process this annotation. So, our object, which is the object that has annotations applied to it, there's another method on the class type which says, is annotation present? So this will look at a custom or any type annotation that may be present on this type. We're only talking about types right now, not the methods yet. We don't know if we want to process this. So we're looking for a custom annotation, custom type annotation. If it exists in there and it is present, then we are interested in processing the rest of this class. Now, if that is the case, we're only going to process one annotation first. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to do a couple things. Let's do it in this way first. We're going to say object.getAnnotation. We want to get the custom type annotation that was at the class level, and that's going to give us an annotation. Now, this is a generic annotation at this point. Now, we want to downcast that annotation to the type of annotation that is actually present, which is the custom type annotation, and that gives us our custom type annotation. We'll call this custom. So let's pull out information from that annotation, because at this point we're processing it. We don't really know anything about the annotation yet. We need to query information to know how that annotation was set. Thus, we can actually say, I'd like to get the priority of that annotation. I want to get the created by from that annotation. And on the last one here, we actually have a set of tags, remember. So we want to get out a series of tags, and we're going to print those tags out, and we're going to say custom.tags. I want to get the length of it, however many tags were available. And I'm going to loop through each and every tag, which is a string, in all of the tags that are there. And I'm really just going to print out the tags. And I'm going to reduce that just so I know I'm only processing the tags that are available. So obviously, I also am going to do one last thing. I'm just going to print out one last property, which is the last modified. Again, this is just printing out my type level annotations. Now, before I run this, let's actually look at the method level annotations next before we start printing everything out so we can look at everything individually. Now, scrolling down, now that we know we have specific methods for this, one custom method annotation, right? So my object happens to be my test that is in question, right? I'm testing this. So now what I want to do is I want to loop through every method that is in my object that is the declared methods. Now I'm not invoking anything, I'm just getting the reference implementation from the methods that are in my annotation example class, basically where I've applied the annotations. So now that I process these, let's look individually. One thing I'm going to do, first of all, let's again first verify if this method, the method in question, remember I'm going to go through every method, is annotation present. I'm looking for an annotation again. If the custom method annotation is present, then of course I want to process that annotation. So by processing that annotation, I will look at this. I'll look at method.getAnnotation. I want to get the custom annotation. Just like we saw before, we only get a annotation itself, which is a generic annotation. Not what I want yet, because I need to downcast this to the type of annotation that I know is present, which is the custom method annotation. Now I've got my custom method annotation for that one specific method. Now, once I look through this, let's do a couple things. First, we're actually going to say, okay, if the custom method dot enabled, which means true if it is enabled, and that is true by default, then we're going to set up a result and find out what the result of this method actually is, if it's enabled. Now, as you recall, we actually have two methods that are enabled. And the first one, now notice we're going to possibly get an exception, and we'll do this just for the sake of example. So the first one we're going to invoke a method, the method itself, and we're going to take an object.newInstance of that, again, our annotation example. So we're going to invoke the method, and it should return a string for us. And we're going to get the result back, and we're just going to print out that custom method that it was processed, and we're going to say what the name of that method is and the result. Now that's one that succeeded. Now just to show that you might, while you're processing annotations, you might have exceptions being thrown, we throw an example on the second annotation. So we're doing that for clarity, just to show how it looks. We're actually going to catch an exception if one's thrown, and we do throw a runtime exception on one of them, and we're going to print out the fact that this did not get processed. We will also say the method name and the cause of the exception. Now, the else statement here is saying if an annotation was not enabled, i.e. it was set to disabled, I'd like to at least note that what method it was that was disabled, because I was told not to process this, or at least the logic that we've put in here says that if it was not enabled, we're not going to process this. So let's look at it, and we're going to log how many annotations are disabled. Now, that's really what we've done to process this. Now, to look at this, let's look at what we're at the end here. Notice we finished our if-else statement, whether it's enabled or disabled. We have a for loop, which loops through every method in the annotation example class. And at the end, we're just going to print out what happened. The result total, how many were successful, how many failed, and how many were disabled. And this is the end of our main method. So now let's give a little bit more room. I'm going to scroll up here and let's actually run this annotation test, which is based on our annotation example, which is processing our custom method annotations as well as our custom type annotations. Now, running an application is, as we see, let's scroll up a little bit here. Actually, let's just make this full screen, for example. So what we have is we were processing our annotation, right? The priority was high. We had a created by. We had 2 tags we processed, Java and annotations, and we had a last modified date. Next, we actually processed, remember, 3 annotations. Now, I'll only go to here right there. That's good enough. We have a custom method, will throw an exception, and we did not process that because it threw a runtime exception. We did try to process this, but it didn't actually work. We had another custom method annotation we processed, and it should not be processed. Thus, we didn't process that. We ignored it. And number 3, we had a custom method, and it should always be processed, and it was actually processed itself. And what we had as our result at the end, remember, is we had 3 methods and 3 annotations we processed. One of them was successful, one of them failed, and one of them was disabled. And that is a good example of how you create various types of custom annotations, how you apply those annotations, as well as how you can process a class that contains annotations.